Let's say that you're doing some research before deciding on a pick for a fight, and pull up the attributes of two fighters. You see that fighter A has a 72-inch reach and his opponent, fighter B, has a 78-inch reach. If all other metrics are equal, you might see this difference in reach and immediately give fighter B the edge, having heard over and over that reach is an advantage. However, reach does not have to be an advantage. Reach can be negated by the fighter with the shorter limbs by learning the matchup and using the physical advantages that come with being a shorter fighter. In other words, reach is simply a matchup issue. Play the matchup correctly and things will come out favorably or at least equal for the fighter with the shorter reach. Fighters like Dan Ige, Hyder Emil, Bruno Silva, Topuria, Ian Gary, and Tom Aspinall all understand this matchup and what needs to be accomplished. In fact, I find it way easier to pick fights when one fighter has a big reach advantage over the other rather than when there is a slight reach advantage. This is due to the fact that a fighter with just an inch or two shorter reach will be lulled into playing the range game, and will be edged out eventually as he gets popped every so often with straight punches and kicks that are ever so slightly longer than his own. However, if there is a big reach discrepancy, there is no question that the fighter with the shorter reach has to try to get in on the longer fighter. The only question remaining is how well they do that. The goal of the shorter fighter is to safely pressure the longer fighter, getting in on the longer fighter where he can land combinations to rack up damage, get to the legs to secure takedowns, or get a KO. This means the shorter fighter stays beyond the range of the longer opponent until he is ready to explode in and rack up damage, then get out before getting countered or getting into a clinch situation, although most shorter fighters usually abandon the pocket prematurely after landing a few good shots.
It's not only one. I'm able to combinate punches,
Strong shots on the inside will trump little pop shots from the longer opponent on the outside to the judges usually. Remember, longer fighters are usually more reliant on the clock, whereas shorter fighters should be less concerned with the clock and more concerned with staying composed and taking advantage of the openings that present themselves. Topuria never rushes in looking for the KO. Instead, he earns the space and openings with patience and focus. It's very easy to get frustrated when you are the shorter fighter, and most outrange fighters just march forward to try to get a hit in. But this plays into the longer fighter's hands, and they will rack up damage over time the more the shorter fighter tries to force a straightforward basic attack. So, the biggest advantage shorter athletes have in any sport is quicker movement, especially when it comes to pivoting and moving laterally. In tennis, you can get to more balls. In soccer, you can dribble through tighter spaces. Running backs in football can fill tighter holes. Basketball players can pivot faster and are lower to the ground, making handles more precise. This is probably the most important factor when it comes to the long versus short reach matchup. This ability to control space with small, precise steps or lurching explosive steps at a moment's notice is key. This quickness in movement will allow the shorter fighter to cut angles to gain a positional advantage over the longer fighter and will allow him to bounce in and out of the pocket between the longer fighter's strikes. Since the fighter with the shorter reach will be the one who has to initiate most of the exchanges, usually having to enter and exit the pocket many times per round, he will need to use mix-ups to avoid being predictable. If the shorter fighter enters the pocket the same way every time, he will eventually get read and countered. So the fighter with the shorter reach will need to keep the fighter with the longer reach guessing, with things like head movement, cutting angles, throwing a variety of different strikes, and using takedowns and feints. Volk is one of the best fighters who mixes in all of these extremely well. Also, the shorter fighter must not be afraid to trade occasionally. Especially on entry, the shorter fighter may get hit with a counter shot. If he's defensively sound, usually it won't land clean and the trade should work out well. Sometimes there is no way around it. The shorter fighter has to take a hit to land a hit. He just has to make sure he's getting the better of the trade. Being fearful of making a mistake and getting hit upon entry will usually make the fighter with the shorter reach more passive and will usually lead to more mistakes. Now let's discuss feints specifically. Since the longer fighter is using straight punches to control space, he is usually reacting to the movement of the shorter fighter. This means that traditional feints with the hands or hips may not be as effective as the longer fighter knows his range and won't react to moves when he knows he is at a safe distance. It is when the shorter fighter closes the distance that triggers a response from the longer fighter. So if we are the shorter fighter and we want to force a reaction out of the longer fighter, feinting an entry might prove more useful. This is prime Dominic Cruz, and it's one of the reasons why he gives excellent commentary when this type of matchup occurs. It is also important as the shorter fighter to avoid the clinch at all costs. I'm not sure the exact reason why longer, taller fighters can bully shorter guys in the clinch so effectively, but it seems to be a widely accepted fact. So when Bo Nickel didn't immediately disengage with RDR, I was extremely confused. Firas Zahabi has a great series on how to fight bigger, taller opponents, and he emphasizes staying out of the clinch more than anything else. Keeping track of the longer man's defensive options after every exchange is another huge component of the matchup. This will allow the shorter fighter to download information needed for reads. Constant pressure will give the shorter fighter more data to work with, as the taller fighter will have to react more frequently. And taller fighters tend to be less defensively dynamic as their reach tends to keep them safe. The shorter man should be in control of the dance at least 50% of the time, or at least not giving up ground. Circling can help the shorter fighter not get backed up to the wall and keep the longer fighter from finding big openings. This is the first thing I look for when picking these types of fights. If the shorter fighter is content going backwards, it's a huge red flag. Superior power and speed is really nice to have for inside boxing, and the shorter fighter will usually have these as he is throwing in bursts where distance to the target is not at the maximum range. Whereas the longer fighter will usually have to throw more volume at a constant pace and want to maximize range. The last thing is getting around the lanky arms of a long-armed opponent. Beyond body shots that seem to be a no-brainer in this matchup, overhands and uppercuts seem to be some of the most effective options, as this makes it awkward for the longer man to parry. To recap, get in patiently, don't get tied up in the clinch, stay on the retreating opponent and know his defensive options, cut angles, move constantly, keep track of every offensive option that the rangy fighter likes to throw. Many times they throw the same 2 or 3 moves. Always mix up the entries to avoid counters, and try to leverage speed and power after getting in on the longer fighter.